just want to thank Dr. Patrick O'Sullivan, the Academic Vice President, for supporting these lectures. It's just an exciting thing to get so many in our community together, and I really appreciate that support. And also, special thanks to the American Studies Department Secretary, Anna Brewer, who has done so many of the logistical tasks that made this event possible. Really grateful to her. So, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker tonight. I'm very happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Carol Quirke. She will be talking about her research based on her recent biography that just came out this year in 2019 with Routledge Press on Dorothea Lange. The title of the book is Dorothea Lange, Documentary Photography and 20th Century America, Reinventing Self and Nation. And at my request, Dr. Quirke brought some copies that she can sell at cost if you're interested in buying a copy, and she might even autograph one for you if you're interested. Professor Quirke is a professor of American Studies here at SUNY Old Westbury, where she has been teaching since 2004. Oxford University Press, published her first book, Eyes on Labor, News Photography, and America's Working Class in 2012. Her essays have appeared in American Quarterly, Radical History Review, and History Now, among other places. She is a recipient of a 2017 grant from the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University for a proposed project on feminist photojournalist Betty Lane. Prior to her graduate studies, Professor Quirke was a community organizer in organizations confronting racial, gender, and economic justice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carol Quirke. I was hoping I'd walk around, but I kind of have a little fever right now, and so I'm going to use the microphone. But if I walk away from it and you can't hear, will you just tell me so? And I'll come right back to the mic. So I wanted to begin by thanking Amanda Friskin, an amazing leader here at Old Westbury, who conceived of and directs Old Westbury's Masters of Liberal Studies program. I have really loved teaching in this program, which offers students a chance to chart their own course in their studies. It's really innovative and hews to the mission of Old Westbury, so it's a great program. I'd also like to thank the Women's Center and the American Studies Department for co-sponsoring this event, and then also thank a variety of folks who provided research support for this book on Dorothea Lange. And that would include my union, am I going to get the union right? United University Professions, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and then also the college generally through the Faculty Development Grant Program. So I'm going to just go back and forth between the book and then a paper, so you get kind of an overview. And so how do you hear me now? Wait, Margaret, can you hear me okay? Really? Okay, that's cool. Okay, this is the picture that I have on the cover of the book. I'm going to start with the introduction to the book. Okay. As a child in the 20th century's first decade, Dorothea Lange learned to make herself invisible. As an adult, she made visible the nation's darkest corners of racism, extreme poverty, and political powerlessness. In between, Lange was a bohemian who rejected convention and sported a green beret and silver bracelets. Friends remember her ascending a San Francisco street with her first husband, Western artist Maynard Dixon. Lange's cape and Dixon's silver-tipped cane, including a stiletto, arrested attention. In San Francisco, she established her career as a commercial portraitist, conveying her client's best self, often constructed through the veils of fashion. Lange became internationally known, however, for showing the nation's poor, many barefoot with their clothes in tatters, those facing, in her words, quote, the last ditch. She took tens of thousands of photographs in her half-century career. She worked for private clients, the state of California, the federal government, and for America's top photo journal, Life magazine. And that was a photo magazine that was seen by tens of millions of Americans each week. Her photos were exhibited in the US and abroad, and in 1966, she became the first woman photographer to have a retrospective exhibition at New York's prestigious Museum of Modern Art. She was also the first woman to get a Guggenheim Award for her photography in 1940. Okay, so today what I want to do is several things. I want to give you a capsule biography of Lange so that you have some sense of who she was as a person. In my mind, Lange is a really incredible human being. Someone who turned tragic life circumstances into a life with deep purpose. Secondly, I want to introduce you to her work and to her lengthy career. Lange is one of the world's most celebrated documentarians. She offered Americans a deep interrogation of the conditions of agricultural labor, of migrant labor in California and Arizona, of the Okies and Arkies forced to leave the Great Plains due to the environmental catastrophe of the Great Dust Bowl, the nation's biggest environmental catastrophe, and of the black and white sharecroppers of the South, who were also being dispossessed of the land that they worked. So that, yes, is the second thing I want to do. Thirdly, I want to show you how photographs make arguments, and I'm hoping that you'll actually help me figure out how photographs speak, how it is that they communicate, and also how they're political. And then finally, I want to introduce you to my own argument about Lange, that she was a photographer whose documentary project was a form of care work, a term developed by feminist theorists in the last few decades. Lange's photos never just documented rural impoverishment, they provoked Americans to consider what happens when the body politic does not care for its citizens. So I'm going to read to you about her childhood, just 2 paragraphs from the book. Dorothea Lange had 2 childhoods. The first one was a sheltered one, with 2 parents and a seemingly loving household. Her family circle included a younger brother, a grandmother, aunts, and uncles. She enjoyed school, and her parents introduced her to theater and music. Her second childhood was one of loss. Polio disabled her when she was 7. 5 years later, her father abandoned the family. Her mother struggled as a single parent to raise her children. Lange became unanchored as a result of these life experiences. But out of those 2 childhoods, Lange remade herself. Her first years resembled the lives of many middle-class girls at the turn of the century. She was a second-generation American, her parents both children of German immigrants. They arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, across the Hudson River from New York City. In the 1890s, when Lange was born, the U.S., like today, brimmed with immigrants. In major cities such as Boston, Chicago, and New York, 4 out of 5 people had a parent who had immigrated from another nation. And even the inhospitable plains of Nebraska or Minnesota, and I'll tell you because I lived in Minnesota, it's inhospitable, and in small mill and mining towns, immigrants were a substantial, sometimes predominant presence. Unlike many immigrant children, however, Lange's early years were comfortable, even privileged. So there's a couple things that I want to pull out of just those 2 paragraphs for today's lecture. First of all, as a biographer, it can be challenging to understand the unique path that a life takes and why a life goes in a certain way, why people make the choices that they do. And I was personally somewhat circumspect about contributing Lange's keen empathetic eye to her bodily and family traumas, however deeply they affected Lange. So she limped the rest of her life. Oop, did that move? That moved. Okay, this is why she's famous, and we'll talk more about this photo later. She lived the rest of her life, and she did say in a later oral history, quote, "No one who hasn't lived the life of a semi-cripple knows what that means. I think it was perhaps the most important thing that happened to me. I have never gotten over the force and the power of it." Of her father, she almost never spoke, including even to her husband. Her second husband barely knew that she had a father. So this was clearly a huge loss to her. His desertion led the family to be evicted from their home. Her mom went to work, leaving Dorothea and her brother with their grandmother who drank too much and was abusive both psychologically and in all likelihood also physically. Ultimately, Lange's mother took her into New York City for school during middle school. She was so unhappy that she did very poorly. She became a truant. She ended up walking the streets by herself as, quote, and she called herself a solitary and a, quote, bad girl. So she was lost for probably 5 or 6 years at least. These experiences ultimately nurtured her focus and her persistence, her willingness to strike out for her own vision in her personal relations and also in her art. She was unwilling to follow the rules. She made up her own. She possessed more of herself and refused to be bound by propriety for women. So that's one of the things that I want to take from her early life experiences. The second is just that she was extremely familiar with a thriving, modern, commercial, heterogeneous immigrant city, which is what New York City was. Raised in Hoboken, which was also immigrant, but she walked New York City streets a lot on her own and came to know them. Her mom worked on the Lower East Side, which was the most densely populated part of New York, or of the world actually, at that point in time. It was a world full of many languages, of Yiddish, Italian, Ruthenian, Russian, German, Polish, Ukrainian. As the leftist poet Lola Ridge wrote in her poem The Ghetto, and Ridge was herself an immigrant, Lange was introduced to the, quote, jostling, pushing, contriving, seething as in a great vat, astounding, indestructible life. So Lange came in contact with a diverse array of people. On her walk, she stepped over homeless men that she met on the Bowery, but she came to feel the city as her own. She also received a visual education in a city full of commercial advertisements, motion picture announcements, department store windows, and high cultural museums and libraries. And I would like you to see, this picture here are both from Louis Hine. Hine is often seen as one of the early documentarians, but he didn't use that word. That word didn't come into usage until the 1930s, when Lange and other people were developing an aesthetic that would come to be called the documentary aesthetic. He called himself a social photographer. And here we have an image of someone working in the garment industry with a lot of, can't tell if those are suits or skirts, on his shoulder, and then men waiting, sort of flocking to a labor agency to get day work. So Hine took pictures thinking that they would be, quote, a lever for social uplift. And I would say that that also explains Lange's impulse as well. Second image of the city is by Jessie Tarbox Beals. And Tarbox Beals was an early photojournalist, a woman based here in New York City for much of her life. Took many pictures of famous people like Teddy Roosevelt, the president, but also went into New York City streets. And this is the kind of scene that Lange would have been part of when she was a young girl from 12 years old until about 18 years old. Now, Lange's mother desperately wanted her daughter to, quote, have something to fall back on, to be able to be financially independent, and you can understand that given the circumstances of her life. But Lange rejected her mother's desire to become a school teacher, and this was an appropriate possibility for a woman, or an appropriate choice for a woman at the turn of the century, when very few careers were open to women. And it's sort of interesting that Lange could even imagine herself wanting to be a school teacher, because she was a failing student. She barely passed out of high school. Right? But the need for teachers was so great, and there were so few options for women. This was something that her parent, or mother, and family pushed her into. But she really didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so she said, long before she even got a camera in her hand, that she wanted to be a photographer. So, I did a lot of research, 7 years of research, and I've read the other biographies on her. I can't really tell you why she said she wanted to do this, but it clearly was the right choice. I can offer you two sort of pieces of historical evidence that might shed light on her interest. One of them is an article that appeared in the New York Times in 1913 that talks about the camera, quote, opening up a new profession for women. And then it provides images of women who have, quote, made good by taking photographs. And Jessie Tarbox Beals is one of the women who's featured in this article. So Lange might have been aware that the barriers to entry for a woman in a field like photography might have been more open than in other fields. So that could possibly explain her interest. I like showing folks this advertisement as well of the Kodak girl. And this was an advertisement from the Eastman Corporation. Eastman's Kodak girl was a pleasing new woman who appeared to be in the company's advertisements an active person who traveled. One scholar called her, quote, a superhero in skirts who bounded as if all the world were her runway. The winsome Kodak girl who followed her pleasures was everything that Lange could not be, fully embodied, untethered to duty or to economic dictates. The Kodak girl would have appealed to a young woman like Lange who felt as if she was being forced into a profession not of her own making. So this is one image of the Kodak girl that comes from about 1900, but that ad campaign ran for many years, and actually the funny thing about it was they were selling the Kodak camera. The sort of tagline was, you push the button and we do the rest. Right? And the idea being, if a woman can do it, wow, anyone can do it, right? So on the one hand, it's presenting a new woman, an able person, but on the other hand, it's also playing on gender stereotypes, probably in some negative ways. So Lange decided she wanted to be a photographer, and at some point, she knocked on the door of the studio of a man named Arnold Genth. Arnold Genth was a portraitist originally from Germany who had moved to San Francisco. And actually this photograph here, which looks very much like a documentary image, was taken by him in San Francisco, quote, the fish dealer's daughter. He was an early documentarian of Chinese American life in San Francisco, but he mostly did portraits of famous people, Broadway stars, movie stars, political figures. So Lange worked for him for a little bit. It is possible, though I have found no evidence to prove it, that she saw this picture in front of Genth's studio when she knocked on the door, because he kept pictures in front of the studio. This is a photograph that Genth took of the famous modernist dancer Isadora Duncan. And does any student in this room know who Isadora Duncan is? Okay, good. So Isadora Duncan was a real bohemian at the turn of the century. She was a modernist dancer. She danced barefoot, as she appears here, or sometimes in golden Grecian sandals. She wore Grecian kind of, I don't know what you would call this. I'm just going to call it an outfit for now. But very transparent clothing. And so she was a bit out there, right, for her time. She was a bon vivant and a communist sympathizer as well, who challenged the sexual double standard and had open affairs with men and with women. She wrote, quote, I do not believe in putting chains and a padlock on life. Life is an experience, an adventure. You were wild once. Here, do not let them tame you. So for someone like Lange, unsure of her path still or not quite finding it, Duncan must have really thrilled to a message like that. So Lange learned a lot from Genth, who she worked with for a while. She moved to several other studios in New York over the course of 2 or 3 years. And then she and her best friend got an idea to take a whirlwind tour of the entire world. And they left. They wanted to start in Asia. And unfortunately, they got to San Francisco and someone stole all their money. So they were in trouble at that point. But the fact was that both of these women were incredibly able. And so within a really short period of time, they figured out how they were going to deal with this. Lange set up a photo studio. She had built up her skills over time. She got an investment from some friends and began to take photographs like these, which I think look similar to the kind of photograph that Genth was taking. Sort of soft, focused, kind of quiet, meditative, beautiful photographs. She set up in an elite shopping district in San Francisco, and the vast majority of her clientele were also elites, often Jewish elites in San Francisco. This is the second photograph that she took, also very sort of fashion-forward-y for that time period. She also, in her studio, met her husband, Maynard Dixon. Maynard Dixon was 20 years her senior. He was known nationwide as an amazing illustrator when Lange was 5 years old. He had a position at the San Francisco Examiner. He also did illustrations for magazines at that time, and over time he came to be a painter and also a muralist. So the first few years of their marriage appeared really idyllic. By 1928 they had 2 boys, and these are 2 portraits of Dixon, who she married. The one on the left, I'm not sure who took that photograph. I don't know if there's a record of who took that photograph. The one on the right is Lange with her son, the second son, who was born in 1928. So it's hard to know why a life changes, but the Depression, the Great Depression, caused Dorothea Lange's life to basically turn upside down. As it did for actually many Americans. So I'd like to show you this photograph and ask you, this is a photograph that she took at the White Angel Bread Line in San Francisco. It was a charity that was run by a woman on her own. It was a private charity. And she went down to the bread line. Lange went down to the bread line. Her studio was sort of smacked down in the middle of downtown. It was on top of a hill, and she said she would look down and see the unemployed streaming from the Barbary Coast, which is where the sailors came from, and then Chinatown and the north, is it the North End? No, that's Boston. What is it in San Francisco where the Italians live?
North Beach.
North Beach, thank you. So she saw these folks walking by and she didn't really know what to do about it. She wanted to use her camera, but she didn't know how. She finally descended and decided to take some pictures, and this is one of the early pictures that she took, White Angel Bread Line. Anyone willing to speak up about why this is a powerful image? Because this is one of her lasting images.
Well, what's the year it was taken?
Probably, I should have written it down, but it's 34, I believe.
Well, it pretty much shows the reality of the Depression. Everybody on this line who look like they're somewhat well-dressed probably had a job, probably lost it during the Depression. And this
let me just ask you, what makes you say they're well-dressed?
The hats and, like, the suits.
Okay, so they've got suits on, they've got hats on, okay.
Yet they need charity right now.
Yet they need charity. What else do you see in this image here?
He has a cup in front of him, and I don't know if that's like asking for money or if he's drinking from it.
It's not clear, but it's kind of open to us, right? So that ambiguity is actually kind of interesting. It might be what makes that photo interesting. Other observations you might want to make about this?
The man in the foreground is clearly grimacing, and his hat is tilted in such a way that you cannot see his eyes.
Yeah,
Which I think is meant to, maybe not meant, but it has the effect of humanizing the grief of poverty.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because the expression is just a really sad sort of
It's
grim
a very
line.
like blank, rugged individual kind of look.
Yeah, but then, it's interesting because his eyes are cut off from us, so we can't actually connect with his pain, but I think that's intriguing what you're saying, like maybe we're able to feel more in not seeing his eyes, perhaps.
By not seeing his eyes, it's emphasizing that he doesn't want you to see him like this.
Okay, so perhaps the shame of poverty, which was an extremely powerful emotional or psychological dynamic in the Great Depression, that there was a lot of shame. We live in a culture that's highly individualistic, that's all about the American dream, and this was the American crash, right? And nonetheless, that ideology of individual success made people feel uncomfortable and sad in this time period. It broke up many relationships, including Lange's relationship, actually. Anything else you want to say about this image? Neil and then...
It appears to be, all men in the picture.
Uh-huh.
There's
no female presence in there.
Okay.
So it's just showing you the kind of like, male, upsetness about what's going on in the period.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Lange is amazing because she is able to capture both the male and female aspects of this economic tragedy. When we stereotypically think about the Great Depression, it is often engendered in male terms, and yet she's able to do both. Yes, absolutely. In this picture, though, she's emphasizing the one. You're right.
Well, she didn't arrange this, but the people who aren't facing us, they do look fairly okay in terms of the way they're dressed. That's true. But the person facing us looks like the end product of what happens when you do this to people.
Yes.
So the guy you really see, the guy who's facing you, is confronting you with the reality of the Depression, which is this is the end product. This is what tons of people look like.
Yes.
They didn't, these guys might be early to the bread line. This one looks like the end of the bread line.
Yeah.
And it's profound. Look at him. Look at him. He looks, gosh knows how old, right? I guarantee he's not as old as he looks. This is what happens when you have nothing for a very long period of time, and you have nowhere to go and no hope. That's it.
No, his hat is beaten up. I mean, this is actually, unfortunately, the image quality is not so great here. So just because of the lighting in this specific arrangement here. So some of the others, people are pretty tattered up as well, but which you can't really tell right now. Jermaine.
Along those lines, that the subject of the foreground is facing us. The subject in the background or not. Is this related to Dorothy's, conveying this contrast of shame, or who doesn't want to be photographed? I don't know.
Yes, and the sort of isolation of people from one another, perhaps. Yeah, the fact that he's kind of almost penned in with those two lines. And I think it's important, I don't know what word you used earlier, but she was a very conscious photographer, right? So she could have taken many different kind of photographs, but this is the one that we have, which there's a story about it almost was lost. This is one of her more famous photographs. It's powerful, right? It speaks on so many different registers to us. Okay, so I want to just now tell you a little bit about the Great Depression, and the photographs that I'm going to use to support it are all photographs that Lange did. And I'm just going to tell you some key points about the Depression. My poor students, I should make them tell you because we had to do this last night, right? You would hate me if I did that to you. People usually mark the Great Depression with Black Tuesday on October 29th, 1929. The stock market crashed. The economy did not seem able to right itself for almost a decade. The stock market within a year, and I actually just looked this up today because I never pay attention to the stock market, 90% of its value was wiped away within 1 year. So, that's intense. Unemployment was incredibly high at about 25% for much of the 1930s. In the African American community, or certain towns like Cleveland, Akron, or Toledo, Ohio, unemployment was at 50%. In Massachusetts, mill towns like Lawrence or Lowell, 60%. And then in some southern Illinois mining towns, 90%, right? So just an utter crash of the economy. Now, Lange took photos of bums. And I'm going to put that in quotes. That's what the very common word that was used in the 1930s. Men reclining in parks, huddled against walls or alleyways, or like here, rags spit out onto the street by the economy. Sorry. In this photograph, against the wall, sometimes it has another name. We see a man turned in on himself, shutting out the world. The light in the photograph is so bright, it's almost like an interrogation light. His face is replaced by a workman's cap. He cannot look into this light. Now, I think this photo is important because she has explained some of her idea of photographing here. In describing this photograph, she said, I want to take a picture of a man as he stood in his world. In this case, a man with his head down, with his back against the wall, with his livelihood, like the wheelbarrow, overturned. I think in that quote, we see a social relationship. It's not just about this individual, but it's about this individual and what's happening with him in a larger matrix. She also took this photograph, which I used to have on my wall probably 40 years ago at work, a photograph called Mended Stockings. This was taken before she worked for the government. The Depression, as I said, was often gendered as male, as the family wage ideal, which saw the father as the main breadwinner. And that ideology, oddly, became even stronger over the course of the Great Depression, even as men were out of work. So it's sort of like the ideology was a kind of odd compensation or something in this time period. In this image, we see this woman's, wonderfully snappy Mary Jane sandals.
This might be a stupid question, but going back to the wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
Was she just walking down the street and she finds the guy like that, or is there a record of did she ask him to pose like that for the picture?
That's a great question for which I have no answer. Sorry. What I can tell you is that when she first started doing what she was doing, she actually was a little anxious. She wasn't that big of a woman, and she also had this limp. And it was kind of weird actually in researching her. For some people, that limp was very present, characteristic of her. For other people, they didn't even see it. She was so vivacious. But she was tiny, she was lugging around this very expensive equipment, and she was actually scared to be out on the streets doing this. She had been working in her studio with a very elite clientele. So when she first started doing it, she often went out with her brother, who lived nearby. But my guess is she never, she was just walking the streets looking for good photographs to take that would somehow represent what the Depression was like. And I have to say that people talked about how hard it was to see the Depression. Because on the one hand, you might be walking the city streets and see a soup line or see the men that you saw before laying on the streets, but you could walk through many other parts of the city and not have any sense of it at all. And so one of the real tasks of photographers like Lange was to figure out how to represent the pain that people were feeling in the Depression. Yeah, and sometimes it's easy, and we'll see a couple pictures today that makes that very obvious, but it wasn't always so obvious. So usually she was sort of out there looking with her camera. Okay, so with Mended Stockings, you have a woman who cares a lot about her self-presentation. She's got, people don't get these anymore, I think we just throw things out, but she had run, in fact, I had a hole in my stocking yesterday. It was like, I had to dump the stocking. Back in the day, you might actually sew your stocking up, right? So here's a woman who cares a lot about her looks. She has sewn her stockings up. And yet, despite all her best efforts, there's still runs, right, all over these stockings. So no matter what she does, she can't sort of contain the effects of the Great Depression. Okay, so I was talking a little bit about the effects of the Depression, and I said unemployment, industries shut down, banks shut down, 9,000 banks closed their doors permanently, 9 million people lost all of the savings that they had, and most Americans didn't have pensions at this point in time, so they would have lost everything. Cities went bankrupt as businesses and citizens couldn't pay their taxes, and other citizens were looking for relief. Chicago and Detroit went bankrupt. They fired police, firefighters, and teachers, many of whom had not been paid for 8 months. So imagine working for 8 months without a dime, right? I'm not sure how people did it. The entire state of Arkansas went broke. 2 million people left home. There were 2 million people who were on the rails, moving from town to town in the hopes of finding work or relief. In many cities, these vagrants, because that's what they were called, might be jailed, right? So the act of being poor was criminalized. Here we have a really great photograph called Toward Los Angeles. In this photograph, again, this is kind of a spiffy photograph, because those guys actually, don't they look like they have a little bit of energy in their walk? But she, as other Farm Security Administration photographers also attempted to do, would often counterpose or juxtapose people sort of trying to survive in the Depression with the promises of consumer culture and advertising culture. And this is a really great example of that. Then we have this one, family walking on highway, June 1938. You know, people talk a lot about the jalopies of the Great Depression, but some folks couldn't even afford to keep a car. So this family is literally walking hundreds of miles with their 2 children, buggies, everything they own in the buggies. I think I got my photos mixed up a little bit. Well, Lange also took pictures of the massive labor uprising that took place during the Great Depression. Many strikes took place at this point in time. We have the rise of the Congress of Industrial Organizations that coalesced in this time period. But in 1934, there were major general strikes in San Francisco where Lange lived, and also in Minneapolis, and also in Toledo. So this is a photograph that she took of a police officer at one of the strike rallies. I don't know if folks know this, people are often surprised about this. Anywhere between 500,000 and 2 million Mexicans were deported during the Great Depression, in the early years of the Great Depression. And some of them were not Mexicans. Some of them were U.S. citizens who, because of the color of their skin, some border official just decided, you know, could be sent south of the border. Lange took many photographs of Mexican Americans. This one is entitled, "I've worked all my life and all I have is my broken body." She took this photograph of a Mexican American tomato picker in November 38. So this was later. This was after the largely after the deportations. She took this photograph of a Mexican mother who says, "Sometimes I tell my children I'd like to go to Mexico, but they tell me we don't want to go. We belong here." That she took in 1936. This was a period in time during the Great Depression where there was much out-migration in the United States. It was the only time that there was more out-migration than in-migration because the economy was so poor. Okay, so the other thing that really fell to smithereens was the farming economy, which actually had started to fall in the mid-1920s. A third of their farmers lost their land in the Great Depression or were forced off land in the Great Depression. This is an image that Lange took of a, quote, Negro field worker in the Imperial Valley, which is in California, which means he was a migrant worker, probably working in cotton, because that was what was raised in the Imperial Valley. Motherless migrant children, they work in cotton. There were no laws against kids working at this point in time. That's something the New Deal provided. So, I mean, I don't know how old this kid is, but what would you say, 7 or 8 tops?
The big one is probably 7 or 8, the little one's maybe 5 or 6.
They're young. Grandmother, she took many pictures of the elderly with their belongings just thrown on the ground, right? Because they might have a tent to put their bodies in at night, but it definitely was not going to fit the rocking chair. So here's a grandmother of 22 children. You know, and that's the tent behind her. She also got many of the, quote, Okies and Arkies, people forced off the Great Plains because of the environmental devastation that happened with the Dust Bowl. Here's a family. I mean, this photograph blows my mind. If you look up here, you see that little boy with his overalls are all basically gone. It's like they've eroded off of his very body. The shirt that he had is also gone. I think this family had walked like 100 plus miles and was heading another 100 miles to get work in the cotton fields in southern Texas. And then there's this fabulous picture of an African American woman. Do you reckon I'd be out on this highway if I had it good at home? July 1938. So here's another image where she's contrasting consumer culture's promise with the reality of life for Americans. So I think what I'd like to do really quickly now, show you a few more pictures and tell you about the critique of the documentary photograph. I didn't want that photograph to be there, but it is. So let's talk about it right now. This is Migrant Mother. This is Lange's most famous photograph. Why do you think this photograph is so powerful? Some people say that it is the most reproduced image in the world. Any ideas on why this photograph works? Have most of you seen it before or no? You're ready for the Q&A, I can tell.
Well, just a few things that I noticed. You can actually make out the dirt green on her forearm, and you could see it on the kid's necks.
Yeah.
And the child on the right side, you could see it on his arm too.
Yeah, even the little
And
baby's face.
you could see the tear at her sleeve.
Uh-huh.
That I'm just realizing now what happened to the rest of that sleeve.
Right, just
They
wrong.
could have used it as like a bandage or a makeshift sock or anything.
Right, or it might have fallen
And-
off and she had nothing to repair it
And
with.
the kids are both looking away, and she's looking slightly off of camera. And
Yes.
I think connected to that element of shoot.
Yes, okay. Some people feel like that gaze, like she's almost like, she's looking in the future, she looks so woebegone, but she also looks sort of powerful, like she's she's determined. So it's a photo that has a lot of ambiguity in it, but you're pointing out, actually one thing I just want to say, I had never seen this. I was teaching this photograph for years, and then I saw like an actual platinum version, which is sort of the fanciest version of a photograph that you could see in black and white, and her arm is just totally crepey. She's not even 30 years old, this woman, and her arm is totally crepey from working out in the sun. But then her skin, closer to her chest here, is like a pearl. Like it shines, it's iridescent. So you can see how the work in the sun and the long hours of labor have sort of affected her body. Kayla.
Oh, I was just gonna say, similar to how you're saying, you can't really tell what's going on her face just because, like, she's I think she's trying to be strong for her children, because I think her children are upset in that photograph just by, like, the way that they are portrayed. And she's just trying to stay strong and, like, I think look forward to the future and not show that weakness of what's going on or how she's really feeling in front of her children.
Okay. Yeah, that seems very fair. Yeah. Any other reactions to this image? Aubrey and then Jermaine?
It shows the savageness of poverty.
Uh-huh.
They're very savage.
Uh-huh. Okay. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful image. It's iconic. I'm going to show you some weird examples in a minute. Jermaine and then Chris.
I was just going to say, for me, it calls to mind abolitionist artists, right, who at a point in the period realized that the emotional connection to the separation of family and mothers being separated from children would galvanize people to support the anti-slavery movement.
Interesting.
See, this is sort of the sketch artists, high art, low art.
Yeah.
And so, for I think for reasons that are somewhat obvious, it resonates, right? Because it is that sort of what's happening and how she's burdened
Yes.
as a mother.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because I'm going to have some examples of sort of Western art, but it's really, I've not made that connection. It seems like a really important one to me. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the better known scholars who writes about her says that she does not take images of women and children all that much, and I think she's so wrong. So I think there's an article to be written about Lange's particular representation of maternity and sort of maternalism, sort of mother love, and how that can be brought into the public sphere. Yeah. Chris?
This may be obvious, but she's not just suffering, she's not just woebegone. She is thinking. That's the first thing. You can tell that this is a conscious person, that she's figuring out what's going on, what the possibilities are that she can build on. And she's not hopeless.
Yes.
She's you know, I don't know if you would call it a look of determination, you know, or whatever. But she's not without resources in her own self. She can think through where she is and plan in some way for, you know, what she's going to do about it.
Yeah.
That seems important because a lot of the photography that you get, or a lot of the images that you get about people suffering one way or the other is just people who are absolutely borne down and
Yes.
suffering.
Yes.
She is suffering, but she's
Yeah.
not just suffering.
She's not abject entirely. Yeah, yeah. Any other, Amy, from you?
I just think that the power of the photo is the combination of dignity and despair that are manifest in really all of the shading, all of the detail, the children clinging to their mother who, you know, while dignified is also obviously despairing.
Mm-hmm.
Just everything about it exudes this combination of suffering and humanity at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That's really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Neil?
I think it also displays the unsureness of the Great Depression.
Yeah, say more.
So, you know, it shows the family life and it shows the unsureness of where they're going to go next, what's going to happen next. You know,
Okay.
who's going to get the next job? What am I going to be able to do to provide for my family? In her eyes.
They were actually parked in a pea picker's field in Napomo, California, which is on the water near Monterey. It's really cold there some of the time. And the kids were eating peas that they picked from the land that were left on the land and birds that they killed. So absolute desperation. Yeah, yeah.
I look at it and I think this is what our national construct was for what we thought about what mattered about family, which is that it kind of didn't. You know, so I look at it and just think it was okay. It's still okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's still okay for this to be the way it is for many kids and many moms and dads. Sort of connected to what Jermaine was saying, you know, that it's okay to have people in these conditions is fine. And you can make these, I don't mean the Dorothea Lange.
No, I know.
And that you can have these pictures as truth and evidence of what's going on. And it's perfectly okay that it's going on. And it just, you know, as an observer, looking at it from here now, I just think to myself,
Well,
what the heck?
yeah,
This
but
is
one
what
of
we
the
think about family.
But one of the things that motivated me is that, and I think we'll get to it, is there is this whole critique of the documentary that basically says that it ultimately was not very political. And I think in looking at these photographs, we can see the kind of empathetic resources that it pulls on that, like, do they exist today? I'm not, you know, I think we have people, I know we have people who are in that condition. I'm not sure we have a rhetoric, a visual rhetoric to help us
I agree.
address those problems. That's all.
We're even more removed.
Yeah.
But okay, so being as removed as we were there, however it is on some scale, it's still not enough connection to say, okay, let's get rid of this because we can. Let's make this not, you know, let's figure out how to make this much better, right? And not that we didn't, we did, but it still existed and it still exists.
Absolutely. Well, and it's getting, yeah, we're not.
And now we're going back up.
So that shot became iconic. I'm just going to show you some examples, show you a few more photographs, and then we'll wrap it up and get some questions, hopefully. The image immediately appeared within a decade, or actually a couple of decades after she took it. She took it in '36. In a Black Panthers newsletter in 1972, and then in a Venezuelan magazine, Bohemia, in 1964. So it sort of immediately attained iconic status. It became a postage stamp. It has been printed on a Merle Haggard record. I still have yet to hear Merle Haggard, but I want to. Paris Hilton appears as the Migrant Mother. There's an artist who's played with her shot, Anne Rowland. And I kind of love this the best, which is the starboards. What are these guys called in white?
Stormtroopers.
Stormtroopers, thank you. So the Stormtrooper and Migrant Mother. So that kind of shows you how iconic the image is. We talked about why it's so powerful. I think it's worth talking about just a couple more things. One is that the woman's presence, she's really in the front of the frame, right? So there's nothing that separates you from her as the subject. There's no distracting details. Dorothea Lange actually passed by the pickers camp and drove about 10 miles, and then she was like, you know what? I just feel like I have to go back there. There's something there, I gotta go back. She went back and she saw this family there. So this is one of the first photographs that she took, and as you can see, she's very far from the subject, and it doesn't have as much power, right? These are some other images that she took. You know, but it's only this image that becomes the iconic image. This is the one that's really powerful that people remember.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
One footnote to that is I read recently that she actually was a Native American.
Yes.
The daughter of a Cherokee. And then the other thing is, did they have zoom lenses in those days, or did she have to get the camera right up close to get this kind of a picture?
She got the camera pretty close up. I don't know how, that's a great question. I actually have no idea how close, but I don't think she was using zoom lenses.
You wonder how intrusive it was, or how it affected the subject if you're like right there. You know?
She had a pretty big camera actually that she carried. She didn't use Leicas were just coming in 35mm cameras at that point in time, but she tended not to use them. She tended to use a bigger camera. And yeah, it certainly would affect the subject of a photograph. The most recent photo theory, which I read 2 summers ago, so it's going to be a little faint in my mind, talks about the fact that every photograph is an event. And that the people in the photograph and the photographer themselves are sort of co-creating this event. And so that theory is a response to about a generation of photo critics who basically said this is exploitative. It's victim photography, it's treating the subjects badly, it's colonizing them, etc. So there's a move away from that, and I see my work as being part of that move away.
But if the camera's that close and still the despair is there, it's a deep despair.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's not even like, what's the word? Not distracting her from despair.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Lange was known for getting people to feel at ease. So people talked a lot about her, both Ansel Adams, who was a very close friend, but kind of a frenemy. And for folks who don't know Ansel Adams, you might want to look him up. He does the fabulous Western images of Yosemite and other places. And they had a decades-long relationship. And they really were frenemies, man. They were always like biting at each other. They were quite cruel to one another. But he talked about how amazing she was with people, that she just let people, their guard come down. Her husband, whose picture is going to show up here at some point because I put it in here, also talked about her closeness. Jermaine, you talked about the sort of iconography within abolitionism, Christian iconography as well. Here we have Michelangelo's Pieta, other images of the mother and child in Western art. Jacob Riis, perhaps the earliest documentarian, Jersey Street rag picker, taken from the 1890s, all draw on that mother and child imagery. The image immediately appeared in a local periodical, and monies were sent to the camp where the migrant mother was living at that point in time. She had already gone, but the rest of the folks who were hanging out in the camp were able to take advantage of it. I was going to, let me tell you very quickly about the critique, which I just did, and then maybe I can show you these questions, because I think I prefer to take Q&A at this point versus telling you more. So I just want you to know that the earlier picture, Migrant Mother, did come under, a lot of criticism. People questioned the documentary tradition. They argued Lange's photos particularly were sentimental, staged, designed to make middle-class viewers feel better about themselves. Photographers were enacting a form of social control upon the photographic subjects, and the viewers of those photographs themselves felt better about themselves by viewing these pictures, but it didn't necessarily make the lives of the people in the pictures any better. Feminist artist Martha Rossler is perhaps the most vociferous detractor. She calls it victim photography. She says instead of promoting a revolutionary politics, it moralizes, it scratches an itch of liberal consciousness and makes the middle class feel good for empathizing. But they don't do anything, right? They just feel about the situation. And so that was the critique. I was very influenced when I first started my career writing about photographs by this critique. I think it's an important one because it makes us realize that the photograph is not just something that someone takes, but they're constructing it. They're thinking about what's before the camera eye. And the photograph communicates in very particular ways. And depending on where the photograph is, how big it is, the words it's attached to, all those things shape how we understand the meaning of the photograph. So I think that critique was an important one, but for me it ended up feeling, I don't know, ultimately kind of deadly. In part meant for the reasons that you sort of said or maybe alluded to. You know, for me it's like, well, can we not use the visual, you know, to enact change? And Martha Rossler, whose work I really love, I don't actually think will move people towards change. I also think that people really had a limited understanding of how hard it was to institute the very meager welfare state that the United States has. It wasn't easy to get the things that we have. We got them in very compromised form, whether it's welfare or unemployment insurance or Social Security. Those were hard battles that were fought to get them. And it was not a revolutionary politics, absolutely. It definitely was more of a reformist one. But even getting that meager change was difficult, and here we are still fighting about it. Some 65, 75, 85 years later, we're still battling whether people should have the right to have health care or have a house. Or have Social Security or pensions when they're older. So I was going to tell you a little bit about my argument on care, and if you have some questions, maybe I'll show you these photographs. What I would say in the most general of senses is that I thought Lange's photographs provoked a kind of empathy or provoked a kind of care. And that the notion that you would have a revolutionary politics that is sort of in your head and you can't have any feeling attached to it, seemed to be a really false binary. And I felt that the feminist notion of care work, which is the work that is done traditionally by women to care for other people, was something that Lange's camera eye was actually doing. She was pushing people to see where care had lapsed. So you can see all the variety of conditions that people are living in where there is no care. There is no public care. Sometimes there is no private familial care. And we can see that. She shows how people care for themselves, which is important. And she also provokes us to care. So instead of thinking about her photographs or other FSA photographs as propaganda, right, where your emotions take over, but you're not really thinking about the issue, I felt like it was important to kind of reverse that and think about how feeling can be used as a tool for social change. And I feel like that was what she was doing. So I'll leave it there. If you want to see some more photographs, I have some here on her depiction of the South. She spent a lot of time in the South. She had never been there, and she was really shocked by the racism that she saw there. She indicted it with her camera. So we can talk about that, or maybe you have questions, other questions about Dorothea Lange that you would like to ask. Chris?
Can you just tell us, like, 4 minutes about the rest of her life?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't put any of that in there. You want to see her second hubby? I know you're not asking about her second hubby. I don't know where you went, actually. So weird.
What was that last picture?
This one?
That one.
That is a picture of kids taken in 1940 in Weed Patch, California. I kind of love that image of children just kind of staring back from the shack that they live. So Lange worked for the federal government from 1935 till about 1939. They let her go. She was not an easy person, but the person she worked for in the federal government, named Roy Stryker, seemed to want to have a lot of control over his photographers. So the ones that he loved best were the young men that he trained to sort of move up and become photographers. One of them, Arthur Rothstein, went on to be the photo editor for Look magazine for years and years. John Collier became one of the premier theorists of visual anthropology. And Russell Lee is another sort of one of these young men. So she did that for, till 1940. Then she worked for the Bureau of Agricultural Economics for maybe a year and did some side jobs. She photographed the internment of the Japanese in 1942 and 1943 and took about 1,000 incredibly powerful photographs, both of the initial centers where Japanese Americans were sent to. She took photographs of the city streets of Oakland and San Francisco where Japanese were living, and then she went to one of the camps, Manson Art Camp. Actually, she also pushed Ansel Adams to go with her. So she did that. She did a wonderful, wonderful set of photographs of the defense industry in Richmond, California. I don't know the exact year, I want to say 42 or 43 for Fortune magazine. She did a couple of photo spreads for Life. And then she started to go abroad towards the end of her life. Her husband was an agronomist. And she went abroad with him to all over Southeast Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America, taking pictures. People usually say that those photographs are not as powerful as her Depression-era work. I'm not convinced of that myself, and if I ever live long enough, I'll do another project on that aspect of her life, because I really actually love some of those later photographs. Her MoMA show was filled with those later photographs, so I'm not really sure why they get criticized the way they do. Linda Gordon, who wrote a big, fat, Bancroft winning biography about her, really tore into those photographs, but I'm not sure it's justified, actually. So I'm trying to think if I left anything back, but I don't think so. She founded a famous magazine, Aperture. She was one of the founders of that, if you're into photography. Yeah. Any other photos, John?
Carol, I wish you'd briefly mention her granddaughter, Diana Taylor, our mutual friend, who became an award-winning cinematographer and documentary film director, and who made a film about her grandmother called Grab a Hunk of Lightning.
Yeah, that's a famous phrase from Lange that has been used. It's a beautiful film. John arranged for Diana to come here. It's Paul, I don't know where Paul's picture is. I have it here like a million times. Arranged for Diana Taylor to come here 2013 or 2014?
Around then, yeah.
Around there. It's a beautiful film, which I actually own, so if someone wants to see it with me, please talk to me. But it's available on PBS as well, so we might actually have it through Canopy.
It's in the library.
It's in the library, that's great. Yeah, she is herself a documentarian and had wonderful insights, I thought, on Lange's life and Taylor's life together. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that Lange learned from her second husband, he was a sociologist. She learned a lot of research techniques from her second husband, and he thought she was a good student of them. He said her ear was as good as her eyes were. And the captions, Lange's captions are amazing. Like if you look at the other Farm Security Administration photographs, all of these photographs are available at the Library of Congress. So if you want to just see some Lange photographs, go to the Library of Congress and put Dorothea Lange in, and you'll see 4,000 some photographs that she took. And you can kind of ask from what states they're in. Yale University also did a website called Photogrammer, where you can see all the Farm Security Administration photographs that the Library of Congress owns, and it's a great tool. So was there something else that you wanted to say about that? No, it was great that she was here. And she wrote a very nice blurb on my book. Thank you. That was nice. Other questions? Diana and then Phil.
You mentioned her husband. I think that's important too. We credit her work for photography. I like the way you're characterizing that as care work, but indeed that their marriage was based on this mutual commitment for social justice, and that what drew him to her was that she could photograph it well, although he photographed too. And what she was drawn to him because he was traveling and he was able to get grants, and there was a real collaboration there.
It was a real collaboration. So her first husband, frankly, I think was a jerk. I don't know if you guys want to hear this or not, but he was just a nasty man. He was like dashing and a bohemian, but he would like leave her at home for months on end with the children. And she basically, in stories in the 1920s in the newspaper, would talk about how much she loved taking care of him and how great it was. But really, she was isolated with her children. Paul Taylor was totally different. He recognized her talent and supported and nurtured her talent, absolutely. I love this picture here. There's several pictures like this, and I was trying to figure out, well, which picture should I put in the slideshow? Because that one really shows you the two of them kind of working side by side. And from him, she learned interview techniques, and she learned to see, I think, in a more social way than she was probably seeing prior to that point. Yeah. And anything else you want to add there, or? No, Diane. Or is that good?
Yeah, no, I think pursuing the idea of care work is good, and this whole notion of care work is also tied to our mission of justice. So social justice is, we're not just caring about things, we are acting on it, and photography is very much an act, not just a collection, not just a document. So I think that notion of care work helps to present that whole action attitude about what photography is.
Yeah, thank you. Did I see Philip? Sorry.
You mentioned in your book that some of the subjects of Lange would ask her, what are you going to do with this photograph? And I was curious if in your research on her you found out more about what she had to say about having such a limited rapport with these people during the Depression she was photographing, stopping at the towns, trying to very quickly take a picture without offending them, and how did she reconcile with that of people not knowing why she was doing this? Documentary photography was not something well known at that time.
That's a really great question. That's a really great question. And, different scholars might come down on this question differently. So some people definitely come down on the side that it's sort of an exploitative relationship, and that she's kind of jetting in there, and then she's jetting out again, right? And she's making her name, but nothing's really coming of it. So I would answer that in a couple ways. First of all, she saw her own mission and that of the government, that of all of the fellow photographers that she worked with, of trying to document the trauma of the Depression, both for that moment in time, but also as an encyclopedia of American life. That's the term that they sometimes used. And they saw not just like the bingo shots, but the entire file as being critical to understanding the American economy and the tragedy of the Great Depression. So I guess their aims were bigger. But you are right that they would go in, right? And take these images. And it's hard, in retrospect, it can be hard to determine, is this an ethical thing to do or not? With Migrant Mother, the story was that for years, the family was very unhappy about the photograph. And ultimately what happened is when the mother was dying towards the end of her life, they sort of publicized that she was this person in the photograph. They got a lot of money to help the mother when she was needing care for cancer at the end of her life. But they came to embrace the fact, and they actually put it on her tombstone, Migrant Mother. But that's anecdotal, right? That's a single instance. In general, it seemed like she was able to build a rapport with people, and I think you see that rapport in the photographs. That would be my argument. Yeah. But people are people, so some people were probably not happy that she was there. And some people probably loved that she was there. So there probably was a range of reactions to it.
Did she have, so that's one part of it. The other side is once the picture's taken, what happens to that picture?
Yes.
And so did she ever talk about the appropriation of her pictures or being utilized in different ways?
She, in her oral, it's funny reading an oral history and not hearing it, because you can't, from the transcript, really tell what the words mean sometimes. So in her transcript, her oral history, like 300-page oral history, she talks about being so identified with that photograph, and she wished that people saw some of her other work. But you can't tell she's actually really kind of proud of it at the same time. So, I'm sorry, what did you ask me? You asked me?
There are pictures in general about how they get used by other entities, they can be utilized in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Maybe she wasn't meaning for it.
I think she felt frustrated a lot. She worked really hard, for example, there was a commission in California that was trying to set up more aid for the migrant farm workers, and she spent months developing her photographs such that this legislation would pass, and then they barely used any of them, and she was like really frustrated. I know she was frustrated that she felt that Roy Stryker, who directed the Farm Security Administration, was always trying to get these photographs out. And actually, let me show you this, because this is a great example. And that the photos often weren't exactly what she wanted them to be, or they didn't choose the ones that she wanted. Okay, sorry, I put a lot of extras in here just because I was too lazy to take them out. But I think this will, somewhere in here, I think. Oh my God, I swear it's here. Okay, there it is. Okay, so she took this photograph, ex-tenant farmer and relief grant in the Imperial Valley, March 1937. So she took a series of photographs of these workers, old men really, right? Forced out of the Great Plains. And they don't look too happy, do they? Like they're burdened. So this photograph appeared in Life magazine. Dust Bowl Farmer is a new pioneer. Right? And this was actually it was a really interesting story. It started with some artwork by WPA artist Anton Refugee of the Dust Bowl. So they sort of aestheticized the Dust Bowl. Then they had a really long story about how the United States is dealing with the Dust Bowl technologically. And then they took that poor guy with his two pals, and they cut the two pals out of the picture, and he becomes, quote, a new pioneer. So this was an example of a story where she wasn't too happy, right? But I think in general she was extremely proud. The work circulated to colleges, to county fairs. It did appear in lots of different kinds of magazines. It definitely had a very powerful pull in its time period, and then obviously the